Hello, my name is Daniel Simon. It's the 10th anniversary of the anthology Business Architecture Management, Architecting the Business for Consistency and Alignment this year. As the editor of the book, now that it's 10 years later, I'm revisiting some of the chapters with their contributors, well, to reflect a little and also look at how things might have further evolved since then. Today, I do have the pleasure of having a conversation with Adrian Apthorp. Welcome, Adrian, and thanks for taking the time to have a chat with me today. So, first of all, Adrian, would you mind giving a quick intro of yourself? Just some highlights in terms of who you are, what you've been doing over the years, and so on.
Thank you, Daniel, and thanks for the opportunity for this session. So, in terms of my responsibility, these days I head up business architecture and portfolio management for DHL Express. That's a global responsibility. I sit here in Singapore at our global head office. We also have part of our global head office in Bonn in Germany. I've been with DHL for quite a few years now in various architecture roles, both IT and now obviously from my title, business. But I also, again, from my title, I have the opportunity to take on both the portfolio management side of things as well as the business architecture. So I see sort of two sides of the planning house, as it were.
Mhm. Okay, so thanks for this little intro, Adrian. Um, of course, as you might have guessed, I do like all the chapters from the book that you contributed to, but I'm honest with you, yours is definitely among my favorite ones. And it's because it provided, well, such a great and clear illustration of, well, let's say, business architecture in action. Yeah? More specifically, business architecture used for change program design and planning. And well, in terms of the approach you presented, you also offered some, I would say, unique insights as to, for example, dependencies between capabilities taken into adequate consideration. More on this in just a few minutes. But without already looking into the approach you presented in the book, could you maybe first talk a little about the need for, or let's say, reason behind it? So, what was it that made you apply a business architecture approach to change program design and planning at your organization?
Oh, so first of all, thanks for the compliment on the chapter. In terms of what made me apply it, well, obviously being an architect and it was before business architecture, more generally enterprise architect, I saw having applied TOGAF, learned TOGAF, that in such a complex environment as the change program that I talk about in the book, that we really needed to get some clarity on what the change really was and the extent that we needed to really structure the whole program. So it was really a way of providing a lens onto quite a complex business change, and taking some of the thinking from TOGAF and other approaches. I saw that it would actually help me with doing that.
Mhm. Now let's take, well, a closer look at how you made use of business architecture in that context. So, how did the use of business architecture for change program design and planning look like? Can you give at least a few highlights of what you described in the book chapter in terms of the approach that you took?
Well, I think there's probably two or three key elements there.
Mhm.
One was fundamentally getting an alignment on what the product was that the business was seeking to um, re-implement using new or borrowed processes, as it turned out. As we were in a situation where we had different operating units across Europe doing essentially the same thing, we actually needed clarity, first of all, on what the product was. So a basic product specification was key. And then as the scope was wide, we needed a good view on the processes, especially from an end-to-end standpoint, and supporting those processes, the capabilities. So getting that complete sort of rounded picture of the product, the processes, and the capabilities.
Mhm. So you just touched on well, capabilities already. So in a nutshell, what was the role, the specific role that capabilities played in the approach you outlined, and what may, in general, what's kind of your view on the role or relevance of capabilities in business architecture?
Well, capabilities gave us a sort of a lingua franca
Hmm.
for how we could talk um, across the actual business units that were working together. So um, in that particular case, it was companies from different countries that needed to work together seamlessly. So process was obviously key, but then getting a common understanding of, well, you're doing this, performing this capability in this country, that's the same as this capability in another country. So across the, the business units, but also, and this I think is obviously the one of the more traditional uses of capabilities as a way of ensuring a common language between IT and the business.
Hmm.
So there was two dimensions to that that make it key,
Hmm.
especially as we looked at which the different business units, they had different IT systems helping to fulfill those capabilities.
Hmm. So let's keep focusing on capabilities. One thing I found particularly interesting in your chapter, as indicated before, is that in what you did, the use of capabilities, well, it did not just make you look at the capabilities themselves, but also at the relationships, right? Or, well, dependencies between them, which is not necessarily something I'd say you come across that often in practice. Yeah? So, how did you manage to identify those capability dependencies? And was it something that you did for the change program in scope only, or did you sort of build a dependency map for all your organization's capabilities over time?
Well, I'll answer the second part first.
Hmm.
We haven't gone quite as far as a full dependency map, but still that approach or technique provides a solid reference for how we look at dependencies, even today. Because going back to that chapter, really the approach I described was looking at the objects, the business objects that sit behind the capabilities, and looking at those dependencies to identify the capability dependency. This was a bit of insight that came from some data modelers that I've worked with within the company, um, and how actually a data model gets built up. That I realized, and some of it's intuitive, of course, that, well, coming back to product, first of all, I've got to have my product or product specification. And I've also got to have my, in our case, an operational network before I can actually start offering that product to customers, and then on to actually, in our case, taking shipments from those customers. So that then leads us to, well, before you do anything, you've got to get that product object in place and the capabilities around it so that you can start introducing the product itself
Hmm.
and the processes that enable the product.
Okay. Are there any other usage scenarios for what you've just outlined, or let's say for business architecture in general? So, other than business architecture being used for change program design and planning, that you found to be particularly relevant or worthwhile to pursue, well, to make an impact over the years? Anything worth highlighting here?
Well, yes, of course, given my current job title. Um, it's probably fair to say that organizations like ours, we have big change programs that come and go. But on the whole, that's not how things happen or get implemented. It's more of an evolutionary process, certainly within DHL Express. So having a clear view of your business architecture and how IT systems, business processes can help develop that and implement that architecture over time is obviously a key anchor for planning purposes. So
Mhm.
not just an individual program, but as an ongoing basis. Um, and just recently, we've been getting much more involved in the product-oriented approach to managing IT
Mhm.
implementation, for example. And if you or viewers have worked with those methodologies, and there's a couple, but they generally come on from the agile stable. They talk about value streams, some lean thinking, which largely I equate to end-to-end processes. Um, Others talk about products and product lines, but when we look into it, it seems to be very much the same thing. I can start equating those products and product lines to capabilities, not just IT systems, but actually the capabilities we're trying to enable in the business. And as we look at aligning our product teams to those products, and then we're much more closely aligned with enabling the actual capabilities in the business itself. So
Mhm.
that for me, that's turned out to be quite an interesting um, insight that I've just come across in the last couple of years for how we can be applying business architecture to shape the way we're delivering value
Mhm.
into the business.
Mhm. And well, generally speaking, Adrian, what would you say? How did the business architecture practice sort of evolve at your organization, well, over the years? And beyond that, let me add another question. Are there any significant developments in the overall business architecture space that you have noticed, yeah, that seem to have occurred throughout the past, well, let's say 10 years? Yeah?
In terms of how it's evolved within DHL Express, you may guess by the nature of our business that we're quite process oriented. So there's a heavy focus on process. There has for many years, and we've developed standard processes which we implement globally. Um, but it's one thing to develop those processes in specific functions of the business. It's another thing to bring those together cross-functionally, and that's actually my role in the company is to bring them together cross-functionally and make sure that if we have a change um, in one part of the business, we look at the impacts right across the business. So it's really evolved up from that focus on process. The other area, when I first started pushing this idea of business architecture, was just to focus on the language of the business. Um, so we have a thing called the Express Dictionary, which
Mhm.
is the dictionary of business terms that we use in the company. So that was actually for me quite a simple way of getting started and then growing out from there. So we obviously have that in place that gets widely used, and then around that a whole set of resources that describe the business architecture both as is and also to be. And it comes back a little bit to what you said earlier, with regards to making architecture practical in an organization like ours, like any commercial organization. We have to deliver value, and
Mhm.
then quite often people hear the term architecture, and some people get concerned of things like ivory towers. Well, hopefully, and I think with what we've done, we've shown how you can actually make business architecture practical.
Mhm.
Coming to the other part of your question in terms of the evolution in business architecture. Now, I have to say, I haven't been studying too much the general development of business architecture. Been very focused on some specific company needs over the last few years. But what has struck me is maybe some of the what I might sort of the qualities of the business architecture are more in focus than they maybe were previously. So capabilities may be looking more at what the business does, but now much more emphasis on how it sustains what it does. So we all remember pandemic now a few years ago. For many organizations, that was a question of how do they stay in business. For us, it was a question of volumes being hit very dramatically one day, different parts of the world closing, and then the next day, volumes going in the opposite direction as people couldn't travel, commercial airlines were impacted, then more people were shipping, obviously e-commerce shipments. So the ability for a company to be in two ways. One, agile. So that's an important agile or agility core quality that we need to ensure is actually part of our architecture at the end of the day. Now, DHL Express, working in a global environment, deals with lots of change almost on a day-to-day basis, whether it's maybe an earthquake or a volcano going off on one part of the world, war in another part of the world, something quite relevant at the moment, tariffs coming into play. We have to adjust to those different circumstances, of course. But for many other organizations, maybe not necessarily have to be as agile as that all the time. So that's a key part. And the other piece that goes with that is resiliency. Being resilient in an environment like a pandemic, but also more and more, I'm afraid, in this day and age, the threat of some sort of cyber attack. We've seen just in the last few weeks how some large retail stores in the UK have been hit. So that's just a reminder of the importance for companies these days of making sure that they are resilient in multiple ways.
Okay, Adrian, any final thoughts you'd like to share? Anything you'd definitely want people to take away from our conversation in terms of making use of business architecture in an effective way in particular?
Well, one thing I'm looking at, struggling with a little bit, is how to make architecture and going a little bit further than business architecture, but also into business analysis, how to make it more real for people. If I just sort of give a simple example, business process modeling. Typically, it's lines and boxes. So some people, architects, business analysts, engineers maybe can gravitate to that quite easily. But for other people, they have difficulty in understanding how to translate those lines and boxes into what they actually do or may do in the future in the field. So coming up with new ways to better model and visualize pieces of our business architecture. I use process there as an example, but another key part, which, and especially in this day of more and more digitalization, is data. Understanding how getting your data structures right and the influence of your data structure on not just your IT systems, but your whole business architecture is something that we need to help explain to people in better ways than, again, using data entity relationship diagrams.
So
those areas of being able to help visualize people, things like digital twins, for example, or simulations, seem to me that quite exciting areas that we need to explore more to help people.
Okay. Thank you very much, Adrian, for taking the time to have this conversation with me. Really enjoyed it. And I think you shared some, well, really great insights. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Daniel. Thank you for the opportunity.